Thank you for joining me again today. This is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. I'm back for a third look at a book, probably the best single book on the resurrection of Jesus. If you want to hold on to a book on your shelf that covers it thoroughly, the book is called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. The authors are Gary Zacharias and Michael Licona, two wonderful experts. Probably Gary Zacharias, I think most people would say he is the leading expert in the world today on the resurrection of Jesus. And the book approaches this amazing event through what are called the minimal facts. In other words, what are the facts that 99% of historians will agree on? And things like that Jesus died on the cross, that the tomb was empty, that disciples reported that they saw him, that it all took place in Jerusalem. Paul and James were early converts and things like that. And these two authors argue for the fact that if you put all those items together, what's the best answer for what happened that day, that resurrection day? And you're going to come up with the resurrection. Well, chapter 5 in the book says, okay, there are people that try to get out of that. They say, no. And so this is a chapter called Always Looking for a Way Out, subtitle of Legends, Lies, and Lapses. And so one possible alternative has been, if you don't want to buy into a miraculous resurrection, is to say it's a legend. And so these two authors, Gary and Mike, say there are three kinds of legend theory. One is called embellishments. Second is non-historical literary style. And third is myths and other religions. So the people that want to say it's legend are going to buy into these three. So here we go. Here's number one. Legend theories assume that the story grew. So the idea is embellishment theories say, well, the disciples never claimed he rose from the dead, but they started telling the story of Jesus, what a wonderful person he was, and the great teachings that he had. But pretty soon people started adding to it, right? They embellished it. And they said it's kind of like the game telephone. You know, I don't know if you ever played that. You got a ring of people and somebody whispers something to the person next to them, reaches the last person. By then, the original message has changed. Usually it's pretty funny. And the idea is if that much can change in just 10 minutes, let's say in a house, what could happen over 2,000 years ago stretching across the globe? And it said even in our own times, you think about it, people start telling stories about their childhood and details change. The old joke about how far their grandfather walked to school and how deep the snow was. So we know those kinds of things happen. They say, take an example as far as embellishment goes, take a look at Buddhist scriptures. You have Siddhartha Gautama. He founded Buddhism right around, let's say, 500 or so BC, but he left only oral traditions of his teaching. So the Buddhist scriptures that we have today, Zacharias and Licona say, arose from two traditions that were differentiated by the languages that they were written in. So we've got a problem there, right? They've added to these. They're highly suspect, these Buddhist scriptures. Embellishment crept into that tradition over time. So are there embellishments that are in the New Testament that are responsible for Jesus' resurrection? Well, Licona and Zacharias say the textual purity of the New Testament is rarely questioned in scholarship. It's been established, really strongly established, and agreed upon just about everybody who studied ancient texts that the text is virtually the same as what was originally written. Even critical scholars, they say, question very few words in the New Testament, and the things that they do question don't affect any doctrinal issues. In other words, we don't have verses in the New Testament that say Jesus lived to a ripe old age and finally passed away when he was 85. There's nothing like that. So virtually the same, right? So very few things are questioned. So the question of scholarship today is, but did legend creep into the Christian tradition before they were put in writing? Right? So, yeah, the New Testament was written, but you had some years there after the events before it was written. So maybe that's when legend happened. So Zacharias and Licona say that's unlikely. There are some problems with that. First, the resurrection story can be traced back to the real experiences of the original apostles. right? So if the embellishments added details over time so that you got a story of the resurrection, then the original story would not have had the resurrection. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the first was just Jesus, then embellishments, and then you get him being resurrected. But it says the evidence from the disciples contradicts the idea of embellishment. Here's another problem. Paul came to Christ through an experience in which he thought he encountered the risen Jesus, but that account is really, really early. So there's no time for embellishment there. Third, the same thing applies to James as it does to Paul. He came to experience Jesus and believed in him way before there was time for embellishment to happen. And fourth, they said the mere mentioning of an assertion is not evident that it's true. Okay, so that's a problem. Now, that was the first thing they said. That's one problem that people are trying to work with to say it was a legend. Here's a second issue that they'll sometimes go for. They'll say it's a non-historical literary style that you get in the New Testament. So, just like a genre is a kind of something, like different genres of music, classical, pop, jazz, rock. And you got different genres of literature, for example, romantic, historical, scientific. So here's what they claim. They'll say, just like there are all these different genres of literature and stuff, if you claim the disciples wrote in a non-historical genre, what they're saying is the disciples didn't literally mean Jesus rose from the dead. They invented a fable about his rising, and they assigned him divine attributes to honor him and to communicate a message. So here's an account of what a skeptic might say when using this objection. All right, so they'll say things like this. Well, we have accounts of dying and rising gods. They're prevalent throughout the Greco-Roman world. The authors back then didn't intend their readers to believe somebody actually rose from the dead. They're just honoring their heroes by giving them traits of divinity. Right? So Jesus' resurrection, too, is a fictional account. You weren't supposed to regard it as historical. Right? Jesus was a great man. That was the main idea. Well, it says that sounds kind of reasonable, doesn't it? That the disciples just wanted to honor Jesus. But they said, once again, you've got some serious problems there. How does it account for the empty tomb? That can be established by multiple arguments, even texts outside the New Testament. So now what? If you got an empty tomb, you got to come up with a new theory. Not that non-historical genre writing. Now you got to come up with something like maybe somebody stole the body. But that's a problem that's weak, too, that they're going to cover other places. All right, so what's another problem with these non-historical writing? A fable or a nice story wouldn't have convinced Paul that Jesus had risen from the dead, right? He was hostile. He was gung-ho to get those Christians. But he was educated. He would have known about these non-historical genres. If he'd read a story once upon a time, there's this guy Jesus and he rose from the dead, that wouldn't have lured him to follow the man that he considered a false Messiah. He considered Jesus cursed by God. And third, same thing applies to James. He remained pious toward the Jewish law even after becoming a Christian. Why would he change his worldview to follow a brother that he thought was a false prophet? And then fourth, if educated people knew about a non-historical genre of writing in the first century, they also knew the flip side of that, which is historical genre. Right? The mere idea that there was non-historical literature is not evidence that the authors were using that. Then the fifth, they said, if you look at the New Testament material about Jesus' resurrection, there are indicators in there, if you read it closely, that the accounts are meant to be historical, not mythical. So look at the two sermon summaries of Peter and Paul that you see in Acts. What does that say there in Acts? It contrasts King David's buried body with Jesus' resurrected body. They say Jesus' body didn't decay in the grave. David's did. And that he was raised up by God. Now, how could Peter and Paul have been any clearer? They were communicating a literal, physical resurrection. If it was mythical, right, just some kind of fable, they would say something like, well, David died and was buried. His body decayed, but his spirit has ascended to be with God. And Jesus died and was buried. Then his body decays, but kind of like David, his spirit ascended with God. Now, that would be more mythical or visionary language. But it seems like the apostles really were using historical language. Here's another problem with that. The response of early critics implied the early church understood the resurrection of Jesus to be historical, right? The response of early critics. So what are we talking about here? Well, how about the Jewish leaders? Did they think it was just all mythical writing? No, they thought it was legit. The Christians were really saying Jesus rose from the dead. So what did they do? They accused the disciples of stealing his body. And then in the 2nd century, you have a critic named Celsus, about 170 A.D. He knew that story of Jesus' resurrection. What did he come out with? He said the disciples performed magic or deception. So do you see what's going on there? Those arguments show that the critics felt that there was an actual, literal, physical, bodily resurrection claim, and they had to deal with it. Okay, then there's a third kind of way that people will try to talk about this as a legend. So first is embellishment. There was an original story, but it was just Jesus, nice guy, and it got added to. Then the disciples just wrote in a non-historical style, which doesn't make any sense. Here's the third one. The resurrection story is just like other religions. It's just a variation of myths that you get other places. So they said, for example, you get stories of risen saviors, or Osiris, Adonis, Attis, Marduk, right? Those are dying and rising gods. So probably Christians just copied or got their inspiration from those accounts. Why would you believe Jesus rose from the dead and make a big deal about that, but you're rejecting similar accounts in other religions? Why would Jesus' resurrection be more credible than these others? Well, excuse me, once again, both Habermas and Lacona say it's true that other religions do have resurrection accounts, but there are great reasons to accept the story of Jesus, but rejecting the others. Why? Well, the accounts of these rising and dying and rising gods in other religions, they're unclear. It says the details of the stories are vague. They're not like Jesus' resurrection. Said scholars today would not regard the stories as parallel. So, for example, we get Asclepius. He was struck by lightning, and he ascended to heaven. Then you get Bacchus Hercules. They rode to heaven on the horse Pegasus, and a few others there. So you look at that and you kind of scratch your head. They don't sound like Jesus' resurrection. What kind of parallels are they? Do these accounts merit the conclusion that Christians copied or were influenced by them? Most scholars today say no. There's such vague similarities, and there are such huge differences. Look at the alleged parallel accounts that are more frequently applied to. So, the first account of a dying and rising God that somewhat parallels the story of Jesus appeared, are you ready? At least 100 years after the reports of Jesus' resurrection. Not before, but after. So then you wonder, so who's copying who? The earliest versions of the death and resurrection of Adonis appears after 150 A.D. So one can't claim that the disciples were doing what these others had done. There's no literature for the disciples to try to copy. It said that a resurrection was reported in these early accounts is questionable. You're not really sure. Like Osiris, there are conflicting accounts. Some say he was assigned to the underworld. Others refer to him as the sun. There's no account that claims Osiris rose from the dead. But it says we can note that the ancient cult of Osiris is the only account of a god who survived death that does predate Christianity. Now, what's that story of Osiris? Well, here's one version. Osiris was killed by his brother, chopped up into pieces, scattered throughout Egypt. Then the goddess Isis collected his parts and brought it back to life, but she only brought back some of the pieces. And it's questionable whether Osiris was brought back to life on earth or seen by others like Jesus was. He was given status as god of a gloomy underworld. So, what do we get? I like their sentence here. It said, Osiris is a guy who does not have all of his parts and who maintains a shadowy existence as god of the mummies. So Osiris's return, as people have pointed out, it's not a resurrection, it's a zombification. And it says the hero of the story is not even Osiris or Isis or even Horus, their son. I'm sorry, Isis is the hero, not Osiris. So that's way different than Jesus' resurrection story. He is the center. He's the glorious, risen Prince of Peace. So here's another problem with these miracles and rising gods. They lack evidence and can be accounted for by opposing theories. So take the example of Muhammad, right? So he's supposed to have had gone to heaven and done all sorts of things. But he said the first miracle accounts of Muhammad don't appear until 75 years after his death and are in sources that a lot of Islamic scholars say is untrustworthy. So they were influenced by developing legends. Now here's another problem. Miracle reports from other religions usually aren't multiple attested, and the first manuscript that reports them is usually far removed in time from when that event supposedly took place. So these stories, these rising gods, these stories were not written and circulated when eyewitnesses could say, yeah, that happened, or no. Here's another problem with these stories. Claims of resurrection in other religions don't explain the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Okay, yeah, so that's important. It says the opposing theories completely fail to account for all the evidence that places Jesus' resurrection in an entirely different category. Many of the miracles in other religions have been disproved, but that doesn't undermine Jesus' miracles and resurrection. Okay, now you have something else here. You got some frauds. So let's see how much time we've got here. Do I have enough time to go through the rest of the chapter? Somewhat. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to do all of these, but I'll just do a few. They call this fraud theories. So it says fraud appears to be the first opposing theory proposed by Jesus' critics. Okay, so here's one fraud. Oh, the disciples invented those accounts and they actually stole a body. And then there's another fraud. Someone other than the disciples stole a body, and then that made the disciples confused, and they thought, mistakenly, but they thought Jesus had risen from the dead. Okay, so here's fraud number one. Maybe the disciples stole a body. Now, their lives changed to the point that they suffered martyrdom. If they stole a body, would that make sense? They faced dungeons and torture and executions. Think about this. Chuck Colson, remember, if you're old enough to remember him, back in the Watergate scandal, he was involved and got thrown in prison and all for covering up the Watergate mess. He said Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up, perpetuated by the closest aides to the President of the United States. And it says, it said, the real cover-up couldn't be held together for 2 weeks. And then everybody else jumped ship to save themselves. So he said, what about the disciples? This is still Chuck Colson. 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, executions. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Colson asked, don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That they might have made a deal with the authorities? None did. So as people will say, well, yeah, but people often join a faith and die for those faiths. That proves nothing. Like, how about the Islamic terrorists slamming airplanes into buildings? But they said this is missing the point. The point is that the sincerity of the apostles indicates they were not intentionally lying. Now think about this. You got these Muslims. They're going to go do those suicide missions. Now, do you think they sat in front of their recruiters and thought, okay, Muhammad is a false prophet and Islam is a false religion. If I do this, I'm going to go to hell. Sounds good. Where do I sign? No, they believed in their cause, right? They were deceived, yeah, but they weren't liars. And so do you see the problem here? The disciples knew whether that was real or not. The Muslim terrorists did not. So merely having a story propagated by the disciples wouldn't have convinced Paul. There's another issue. He was an enemy of the church, and James. So right now, it's that only a small number of critical scholars have opted for that view that the body got stolen. But what if somebody else besides the disciples stole the body? Said, well, I can't account for the known historical facts, so hardly any scholars hold that now. Said the empty tomb by itself wouldn't have convinced Paul, would it? No. Would it have convinced James? No. The empty tomb didn't appear to lead any of Jesus' followers except John to believe that he'd risen from the dead. So fraud, too, could only call into question the cause of the tomb, but not the resurrection. So the strongest evidence for Jesus' resurrection is the appearance to the disciples, Paul and then James. So the empty tomb convinced no one. All right, so there are some more theories. You know what? I think I can get through this. If you don't mind hanging on, we'll make this one a little bit longer. What about this? The witnesses went to the wrong tomb, right? The women, the disciples, went to the wrong tomb. They saw it was empty, and they said, Jesus is risen. Wow, that's a pretty lame theory, I think. These two authors point out 6 problems. If they went to the wrong tomb, that doesn't account for the fact that they saw the risen Jesus. The testimony of the gospel is that the empty tomb convinced no one but John. The church persecutor, Paul, he changed because of seeing the risen Jesus, not because of an empty tomb. James wouldn't have been convinced by an empty tomb. Fifth here is no source supports the wrong tomb theory. If the women and disciples had gone to the wrong tomb, then all the Romans and the Jews would have to do is just go to the right tomb and say, there it is, there's the body, publicly display it, and there goes Christianity. And then 6, the evidence suggests the tomb's location really was known. It wasn't so confusing. Joseph of Arimathea, apparently a well-known individual, buried Jesus in his own tomb. Okay, here's another problem, another way people try to get around the actual resurrection. It's called the apparent death theory, or the swoon theory, right? That seems unlikely. I mean, think about, as they point out, what scourging and crucifixion was like. And I won't go into the detail of that, but you're really basically ripping a guy's back apart, even exposing some of his organs and muscles. And, of course, crucifixion. Romans knew how to crucify. There's no way they're going to let a guy off that cross while he's still alive. So the intense agony there. And then, of course, the spear wound. So it said, here it is about the spear wound they're talking about. That's John 19. It says the blood and water, as described as flowing from his heart, were probably due to rupturing a sac that surrounded the heart, called the pericardium. And they said one Roman author, Quintilian, reported the Romans would do this on several crucifixion victims. So then you knew, no question, this person is dead. The one liberal scholar, this is interesting, one liberal scholar who thought hallucinations would account for the risen Jesus ended up tearing apart the swoon theory. He said it's not plausible. He said, really? You're going to scourge and crucify a man, and Jesus is then going to push that heavy stone away and walk blocks on pierced and wounded feet. And even if that was possible, he shows up to his disciples and says, I'm the risen Prince of Peace. No, that's not going to happen. So even if Jesus got off the cross, the disciples wouldn't have been convinced he'd risen from the dead. He would have looked horrible. And the apparent death theory can't account for Paul's reversal. So I think they have shot holes in all these alternate theories, which must frustrate people trying to come up with an alternative to this actual resurrection. Anyway, I think you would like this book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Habermas and Lacona are good authors, and I think you agree after hearing that part that I went over today, that they are thorough and they're clear, and they do a wonderful job. Well, thank you for being part of our podcast today. Take care.